Now, before we move on to the explanation, we should know the meaning of the word surgery here. Surgery here does not mean the medical procedure, but it means a place where a doctor, a dentist, or a veterinary doctor treats or advises. So, surgery, it does not mean what we have the word surgery in our mind when we hear surgery, so we relate it to an operation, a procedure related to some operation. But here, surgery, it is a place. It is a place where a doctor, a dentist, or a veterinary doctor treats and advises. So, keeping this in mind, we'll be reading the chapter. So, let's begin. Now, first of all, the basic theme. The basic theme is that excess of everything is bad. So, in this chapter, we'll be talking about how excess of everything it can become life-threatening. So the story Triumph of Surgery establishes this fact in a humorous way. It is a humorous story, but it has a deep reflective message also. So Mrs. Pumphrey is a rich but lonely lady. She has a pet dog named Tricky, who is the center of all her attention throughout the day. She thus has over-pampered him. She expresses her love and care for the dog by over-indulging in him. Everything that she does is lavish: his clothes, toys, beds, eating bowls, and even meals. With no physical exercise, Tricky becomes extremely fat and is on the verge of death. Mrs. Pumphrey's ignorance about the upkeep of a dog and finding pleasure in overfeeding Tricky become life-threatening for him. So excess here is in the love. So because of her love and care, she lavishly spends on the dog, on his clothes, toys, beds, eating bowls, and even meals. And the result is that the dog becomes excessively fat. Now, there's another point because she is doing this in her ignorance. So, a little knowledge is also a dangerous thing. So, on the other hand, the tact, wit, and intelligence of Dr. Harriet is able to save Tricky. So, then on the other hand, there's Dr. Harriet. So, with his tact, he is able to save Tricky. His keen observation senses the threat to Tricky's life and is quick to decide on the line of treatment to save him. He is wise enough to understand the real problem and succeeds in taking Tricky away from Mrs. Pumphrey for treatment. He cures Tricky without performing any surgery on him or keeping him under any medication. So Tricky just had to be kept away from the excess of everything so that he was receiving. So this is the theme, or you can say the gist of the chapter. And now we'll be doing line by line explanation. So let's get started with it. I was really worried about Tricky this time. I had pulled up my car when I saw him in the street with his mistress, and I was shocked at his appearance. So, this is the narrator, Dr. Harriet. He is narrating his story and his experience with Tricky and Mrs. Pumphrey. So, he says that he was very worried. Tricky को उसने देखा, वो कार में कहीं जा रहा था, but on the street he saw Tricky and he stood there. He pulled up his car, means he stopped there, and he was shocked to see Tricky's appearance. So, what did Tricky look like? So, you can see here in the picture, fat like a sausage. He had become hugely fat, like a bloated sausage, with a leg at each corner. So, you can see like this. His eyes, bloodshot and rheumy, stared straight ahead, and his tongue lolled from his jaws. So, this is Tricky, fat like a sausage, and Mrs. Pumphrey, who was doing this, who was overfeeding it because of her ignorance. Mrs. Pumphrey hastened to explain. He was so listless, Mr. Harriet, he seemed to have no energy. Now, Mrs. Pumphrey thought that the जो dog है, वो बहुत lazy है because उसमें energy नहीं है, वो बहुत weak हो गया. So, therefore, she was feeding it with even more. So he says that I thought he must be suffering from malnutrition. So I have been giving him some little extras between meals to build him up. Some malt and cod liver oil and bowl of Horlicks at night to make him sleep. Nothing much really. So Mrs. Pumphrey डॉक्टर हैरियट को बता रही है कि क्योंकि मुझे लग रहा है कि जो ट्रिकी है वो ज़्यादा मूव नहीं कर रहा है, उसमें एनर्जी नहीं है, एक्टिव नहीं है, सो आई फेल्ट दैट ही हैज़ बिकम वीक, ही सफरिंग फ्रॉम माल न्यूट्रिशन. तो इसलिए मैंने उसे कुछ एक्स्ट्राज बिटवीन हर रेगुलर मील्स, मतलब रेगुलर मील्स तो वो खा ही रहा है, लेकिन रेगुलर मील्स के बीच में भी उसे कुछ एक्स्ट्रा देना शुरू कर दिया, जैसे कि मॉल्ट, कॉड लिवर ऑयल, बोल ऑफ हॉर्लिक्स. ज़्यादा कुछ नहीं, नथिंग मच रियली. वो कह रही है कि ज़्यादा कुछ नहीं, बस इतना सा ही. And did you cut down on the sweet things as I told you? Oh, I did for a bit, but he seemed to be so weak I had to relent. So Dr. Harriet, he is very concerned. वो पूछ रहा है मिसेस पम्फ्री से कि मैंने आपको कहा था कि स्वीट थिंग्स जो हैं वो इसे मत देना, तो क्या आपने वो किया? So मिसेस पम्फ्री क्या कह रही है? Oh yes I did, I tried that, but he seemed to be so weak, so I had to relent. So वो कह रही है कि लेकिन वो मुझे इतना कमज़ोर लगा कि मुझे फिर रिलेंट करना पड़ा। रिलेंट मतलब मुझे गिव अप करना पड़ा और मैंने उसे स्वीट्स फिर से देना शुरू कर दिया। सो ही डज लव आइसक्रीम्स, केक्स एंड चॉकलेट्स। आई कांट बेयर टू रिफ्यूज हिम। सो मिसेस पम्फ्री कह रही है कि उसे चॉकलेट्स और केक्स इतने अच्छे लगते हैं ट्रिकी को कि मैं रिफ्यूज नहीं कर सकती। आई लुक्ड डाउन अगेन एट द लिटिल डॉग, दैट वॉज द ट्रबल। सो ये है ट्रिकी। सो डॉक्टर हैरियट को पता लग गया कि ट्रिकी का असली ट्रबल क्या है। सो द ट्रबल इज his fault is greed. So Tricky's only fault was greed. He had never been known to refuse food. So Tricky को किसी भी टाइम कुछ भी खाने को दे दो तो Tricky ने खा लेना है. He would tackle a meal at any hour of the day or night. I wondered about all the things Mrs. Pumphrey hadn't mentioned. Now Dr. Harriet, उन्हें Mrs. Pumphrey का बिल्कुल पता है, and he was thinking कि ये जो चीज़ें Mrs. Pumphrey ने बताई हैं इसके अलावा अभी और कितनी लंबी लिस्ट हो सकती है. Are you giving him plenty of exercise? So फिर डॉक्टर हैरियट पूछता है कि चलो खाना का तो आपने मुझे बता दिया. Are you giving him exercise also? Because that is also very important. Now let's see what Mrs. Pumphrey says. Well, he has his little walks with me, as you can see. But Hodgkin, the gardener, has been down with lumbago. So there has been no ring throwing lately. So there has been no exercise also. So Mrs. Pumphrey जो है वो बता रही है कि आप देख रहे हैं कि इस तरह की शॉर्ट वॉक्स वो मेरे साथ ले रहा है ट्रिकी, बट जो हमारा गार्डनर है, गार्डनर हॉचकिन, उसकी पीठ में थोड़ा दर्द है. सो लम्बागो इज बैक एक, लोअर पार्ट ऑफ योर बैक. सो उसकी पीठ में दर्द होने की वजह से ही हैज़ नॉट बीन कमिंग. सो इसलिए वो रिंग थ्रोइंग वाली जो एक्सरसाइज है वो बंद है कुछ दिनों से. I tried to sound severe. So अब जो डॉक्टर हैरियट है वो मिसेस पम्फ्री को firmly ये कहते हैं, now I really mean this. If you don't cut his food right down and give him more exercise, he's going to be really ill. You must harden your heart and keep him on a strict diet. So डॉक्टर हैरियट उसे strictly मिसेस पम्फ्री को कहते हैं कि this is going to be bad, so you really need to cut down his diet. So let's see what happens. So you can see the bloated tricky hair. Mrs. Pumphrey wrung her hands. Oh, I will, Mr. Harriet. I'm sure you are right, but it is so difficult, so very difficult. So Mrs. Pumphrey, Dr. Harriet को कहते हैं कि I know कि आप बिल्कुल ठीक कह रहे हैं, अपने हाथ ऐसे झटकती हुई. So she is telling him, but ये बहुत मुश्किल काम है. So she set off, head down along the road, as if determined to put the new regime into practice immediately. So वो ट्रिकी को लेके जा रही हैं और दिमाग में ऐसे सोच में है जैसे कि आज से अभी से जाते ही वो न्यू स्ट्रिक्ट डाइट वाला regime जो है शुरू कर देंगी. So I watched their progress with growing concern. डॉक्टर हैरियट जो है उनको बहुत बहुत ज़्यादा ख्याल है ट्रिकी का. So Tricky was tottering along in his little tweed coat. So he's wearing a coat and he is moving very slowly. He had a whole wardrobe of these coats for the cold weather and a raincoat for the wet days. He struggled on, drooping in his harness. I thought it wouldn't be long before I heard from Mrs. Pumphrey. So जैसे Tricky जो है उसको लेके जा रही है Mrs. Pumphrey, Dr. Harriet, he is in deep thought. So वो ट्रिकी को जाते हुए देख रहे हैं. ट्रिकी ड्रूप कर रहा है, इतना हैवी वेट है ट्रिकी का कि उसकी गर्दन जो है वो नीचे को झुकी हुई है एंड ही इज ड्रूपिंग एंड ही इज स्ट्रगलिंग टू वॉक. और डॉक्टर हैरियट को ये लग रहा है कि जल्दी ही मिसेस पम्फ्री की तरफ से उनको कॉल आने वाला है. सो वो कॉल ऑब्वियसली अच्छी बात का कॉल नहीं होने वाला. The expected call came within a few days. Mrs. Pumphrey was distraught. Tricky would eat nothing. So जैसा डॉक्टर हैरियट ने एक्सपेक्ट किया था वैसे ही उनको वो कॉल आ जाता है. और मिसेस पम्फ्री वॉज डिस्ट्रॉट मीन्स शी वॉज वेरी डिस्ट्रेस्ड, वेरी वरिड एंड वेरी एंक्शियस. ट्रिकी ने खाना पीना बंद कर दिया था. So refused even his favorite dishes, and besides he had bouts of vomiting. He spent all his time lying on a rug panting. So Tricky जो है वो बिल्कुल नहीं खा रहा था, उसे लंबी लंबी सांसें आ रही थी and he was vomiting also. Didn't want to go for walks, didn't want to do anything. I had made my plans in advance. The only way was to get Tricky out of the house for a period. So Dr. Harriet जो है उन्होंने अपना plan पहले ही बनाया हुआ था, and he knew that the only thing that is going to treat Tricky was to take Tricky away from Mrs. Pumphrey for a few days. I suggested that he be hospitalized for about a fortnight to be kept under observation. So doctor hospitalize करने की सलाह देते हैं Mrs. Pumphrey को, and doctor obviously is very firm and is very serious. The poor lady almost swooned. She was sure he would pine and die if he did not see her every day. So swooned here means that almost fainted to hear that Tricky had to be hospitalized. So Mrs. Pumphrey जो है उनको एकदम से जैसे चक्कर आ जाते हैं ये बात सुन के, एंड मिसेस पम्फ्री शी वाज श्योर कि ट्रिकी उनके बिना बिल्कुल नहीं रह सकेगा. बट आई टुक अ फर्म लाइन. ट्रिकी वाज वेरी इल एंड दिस वाज द ओनली वे टू सेव हिम. लेकिन डॉक्टर हैरियट ने कहा कि आई वाज फर्म दिस टाइम, और मुझे लगा और मैंने समझाया मिसेस पम्फ्री को दैट दिस इज द ओनली वे टू ट्रीट हिम. In fact, I thought it best to take him without any delay. So Dr. Harriet, he thought that immediately he should take Tricky from there. And followed by Mrs. Pumphrey's wailings, I marched out to the car carrying the little dog wrapped in a blanket. So Mr. Harriet, he took Tricky and put him in his car. And Mrs. Pumphrey, obviously, she was wailing, she was crying, she didn't want Tricky to be taken away. But Dr. Harriet, he felt that that was the only way. The entire staff was roused, and maids rushed in and out, bringing his daybed, his nightbed, favorite cushions, toys, rubber rings, breakfast bowl, lunch bowl, supper bowl. Realizing that my car would never hold all the stuff, I started to drive away. So now Mrs. Pumphrey called all the servants to bring Tricky's stuff. So all his beds, all his bowls, all his cushions, they were stuffed in the car. Now Dr. Harriet realized that all this stuff is not going to get inside his car, so he just moved the car. As I moved off, Mrs. Pumphrey, with a despairing cry, threw an armful of her little coats through the window, so all the stuff in the car. I looked in the mirror before I turned the corner of the drive. Everybody was in tears. So all the servants and even Mrs. Pumphrey, they were crying when Tricky was being taken away. So obviously, Mrs. Pumphrey loved Tricky, but Tricky was actually under threat because of Mrs. Pumphrey only. Out on the road, I glanced down at the pathetic little animal gasping on the seat by my side. I patted the head, and Tricky made a brave effort to wag his tail. So Tricky was really very sick. Poor old lad, I said. You haven't a kick in you, but I think I know a cure for you. So Dr. Harriet, he is speaking to Tricky, and he says, you haven't a kick in you, but I think I know a cure for you. Now, haven't a kick means no energy. So he was just lying there listless, without any energy. So therefore, Dr. Harriet says that I know that how to treat you. So let's see what Dr. Harriet does. At the surgery, the household dogs surged round me. Tricky looked down at the noisy pack with dull eyes, and when put down, lay motionless on the carpet. So जैसे ही डॉक्टर हैरिट सर्जरी में पहुंचते हैं, तो वहाँ पे जो और डॉग्स हैं, जो पहले से और डॉग्स हैं, they all surged down. So all dogs, they came around Dr. Harriet, and they actually wanted to see who was in the lap of Dr. Harriet. Now, when Dr. Harriet put Tricky down, so Tricky lay there motionless. Tricky बिल्कुल भी उसने वहाँ पे move नहीं किया. So other dogs, after sniffing around him for a few seconds, decided that he was an uninteresting object and ignored it. So even the other dogs there, उन्होंने ट्रिकी को इग्नोर किया बिकॉज ट्रिकी मोशनलेस रक की तरह वहाँ पड़ा था. कोई हिलजुल नहीं, कोई एक्टिविटी नहीं, कोई एनर्जी नहीं. सो इवन द अदर डॉग्स दे वेंट अवे. I made up a bed for him in a warm, loose box next to the one where the other dogs slept. For 2 days, I kept an eye on him, giving him no food but plenty of water. At the end of the second day, he started to show some interest in his surroundings, and on the third, he began to whimper when he heard the dogs in the yard. So 2 दिन तक ट्रिकी को कुछ नहीं दिया खाने को, सिर्फ पानी. और उसके बाद ट्रिकी ने थोड़ी सी एक्टिविटी और थोड़ा सा इंटरेस्ट सराउंडिंग में दिखाना शुरू किया. On the third day, he began to whimper when he heard the dogs in the yard. So, dogs in the yard, they were playing, they were fighting in each other, they were running, and Tricky ने उनकी आवाज़ें सुन के थोड़ा सा whimper किया. Whimper means थोड़ी थोड़ी आवाज़ें निकाली. When I opened the door, Tricky trotted out and was immediately engulfed by Joe, the greyhound, and his friends. So, after rolling him over thoroughly, Inspecting him, the dogs moved off down the garden. So ट्रिकी जो है वो धीरे धीरे से बाहर आया और बाकी के डॉग्स जो है वो ट्रिकी के आसपास आ गए. So they inspected ट्रिकी for a while and उन्होंने ट्रिकी को रोल किया और उसके बाद डॉग्स जो है वो अपनी अपनी मस्ती में फिर चले गए. So ट्रिकी followed them. So ट्रिकी धीरे धीरे उनके पीछे जाने लगा, rolling slightly with a surplus fat. So अभी भी ट्रिकी बहुत फैट था. So later that day I was present at feeding time. अब feeding time हुआ, so I watched while Tristan slopped the food into the bowls. So Tristan वहाँ का caretaker है, so उसने हर food bowl में food जो है वो डाल दिया. So then there was usual headlong rush, followed by the sounds of high speed eating. So जैसे ही food bowls में पहुंचा, all the dogs they ran quickly towards the bowls because they knew कि जो पीछे रह गया उसे खाना नहीं मिलेगा. So they started and they always ate with high speed. So every dog knew that if he fell behind the others, he was liable to have some competition for the last part of his meal. So जो पीछे रह गया, so उसके food bowl में competition आ जाएगा. So इसलिए all the dogs with full energy and full speed अपने अपने bowls की तरफ भागते थे. लेकिन अब ट्रिकी तो इतना फैट था, वो तो भाग ही नहीं सकता था. So let's see what happened then. When they had finished, Tricky took a walk round the shining bowls, licking casually inside one or two of them. Next day, an extra bowl was put out for him, and I was pleased to see him jostling his way towards it. So Tricky, जब सबने सब कुछ खत्म कर दिया, so Tricky he goes to those bowls and he started licking those empty bowls. So this showed that now Tricky had an appetite to eat. उसे भूख लगनी शुरू हुई. So उसके बाद से डॉक्टर हैरियट ने एक एक्स्ट्रा बोल ट्रिकी के लिए रखना शुरू किया. From then on, the progress was rapid. So उसके बाद ट्रिकी में improvement बहुत जल्दी आने लग गई. He had no medical treatment of any kind, but all day he ran about with the dogs, joining in their friendly scrimmages. Scrimmages means friendly fights. So what other dogs were doing, playing and running here and then, Tricky also started doing the same. He discovered the joys of being bowled over, tramped on, and squashed every few minutes. तो उसे इन सब चीज़ों में मज़ा आने लगा दूसरों dogs के साथ खेलने में. So he became an accepted member of the gang, an unlikely, silky little object among the shaggy crew. So Tricky, उसने बॉल को लिक किया और डॉक्टर हैरियट को पता लग गया that he is hungry, and then another bowl was kept for him, and after that Tricky started mixing up with other dogs. So he became an accepted member of the gang, an unlikely, silky little object among the shaggy crew. So he was silky because he was a pampered dog, और बाकी जो सब dogs थे they were rough. Shaggy crew means all rough and tough dogs, fighting like a tiger for his share at mealtime. So Tricky also started fighting like a tiger for his share during the meal times and hunting rats in the old hen house at night. So Tricky even accompanied other dogs to hunt rats in the old hen house at night. He had never had such a time in his life. So Tricky was enjoying a lot there. And he was progressing. All this while, now Mrs. Pumphrey hovered anxiously in the background, ringing a dozen times a day for the latest bulletin. So now Mrs. Pumphrey there, she was so worried. She was ringing Dr. Harriet every other minute for latest bulletins to know about the progress. I dodged the questions about whether his cushions were being turned regularly or his correct coat worn according to the weather, but I was able to tell her that the little fellow was out of danger and convalescing rapidly. So डॉक्टर हैरियट बताते हैं कि फोन पे फोन मिसेस पंफ्रे का. सो ही वॉज डॉजिंग द क्वेश्चंस मीन्स ही वॉज अवॉइडिंग द क्वेश्चंस टू आंसर कि वेदर उसका कौन सा कुशन उसे दिया है, उसका डे बेड और उसका नाइट बेड, और उसे कौन सा कोट पहनाया है, शाम वाला पहनाया है कि सुबह वाला पहनाया है. सो ही सेज दैट आई वाज डॉजिंग सच क्वेश्चंस, बट आई टोल्ड मिसेस पंफ्रे दैट ही वाज आउट ऑफ डेंजर और वो इम्प्रूव कर रहा था. नाउ hearing that he is improving, the word convalescing means progress, to improve, to show progress in the treatment. So seemed to do something to Mrs. Pumphrey. So ये word सुनते ही Mrs. Pumphrey के अंदर कुछ जागा. So what she did, she started to bring round fresh eggs, 2 dozen at a time, to build up Tricky's strength. So वो वहाँ पे रोज सर्जरी पे eggs पहुँचाने लग गई. Then for a happy period, my partners and I had 2 eggs each for breakfast. Now वो eggs Tricky को तो देने नहीं थे. So The people at the Tricky, the doctor and his caretakers and his helpers, they enjoyed 2 eggs at breakfast. But when the bottles of wine began to arrive, then the real possibilities of the situation began to dawn on the household. So when wine started arriving, so then they thought of real possibilities. Now, what were the real possibilities there? Actually, these wine bottles, they were to enrich Tricky's blood. But lunch became a ceremony there, so a ceremonial occasion. So real possibilities was to celebrate. So with 2 glasses of wine before and several during the meal. So eggs and wine, they were enjoyed by all the people there at surgery. We could hardly believe it when Brandy came to put a final edge on Tricky's constitution. So they could not believe that Mrs. Pumphrey sending Brandy for Tricky. For a few nights, the fine spirit was rolled around, inhaled, and reverently drunk. So fine spirit here refers to brandy. So the doctor says that for a few nights we inhaled and we were drinking brandy before bed. There were days of deep content, starting well with the extra egg in the morning, improved and sustained by the midday wine, and finishing luxuriously round the fire with the brandy. So now Dr. Harriet is describing his days. His days of content here means his days of satisfaction, and his days of lavish meals, when all the things that were actually sent by Mrs. Pumphrey for Tricky, they were being enjoyed by Dr. Harriet and his caretakers and helpers there. So it was a temptation to keep Tricky on as a permanent guest. So obviously, Dr. Harriet had this temptation कि Tricky को अपने पास ही रख लेते, so इतना tasty सामान आता जाएगा. So but I knew Mrs. Pumphrey was suffering, and after a fortnight felt compelled to phone and tell her that the little dog had recovered and was awaiting collection. So at last, Dr. Harriet called Mrs. Pumphrey and told her that the dog is recovered completely and he is waiting collection. Waiting collection means कि उसे आके ले जा. So within minutes, about 30 feet of gleaming black metal drew up outside the surgery. So एक लंबी सी black car within a few minutes वहाँ पहुँच जाती है, and the chauffeur opened the door and I could just make out the figure of Mrs. Pumphrey almost lost in the interior. Almost lost in the interior means कि इतनी luxurious car थी. So Mrs. Pumphrey was sitting inside it. Her hands were tightly clasped in front of her. Her lips trembled. Oh, Mr. Harriet, do tell me the truth. Is he really better? So Mrs. Pumphrey, still concerned about Tricky, and asked Mr. Harriet if Tricky was all right. Yes, he's fine. There's no need for you to get out of the car. I'll go and fetch him. So Dr. Harriet told him that don't come out of the car. I'll bring Tricky. So he goes back and he will now bring Tricky. So I walked through the house into the garden. A mass of dogs was hurtling round and round the lawn, and in their midst, ears flapping, tail waving, was the little golden figure of Tricky. So Tricky was among those dogs and he was running with the dogs, flapping his ears and tail waving. So Tricky was there, a little golden figure. In 2 weeks, he had been transformed into a lithe, hard-muscled animal. He was keeping up well with the pack, stretching out in great bounds, his chest almost brushing to the ground. I carried him back along the passage to the front of the house. Now, within 2 weeks, Tricky had been there at surgery for 2 weeks. So within 2 weeks, he was completely transformed. He was transformed into a hard-muscled animal. एकदम robust, strong animal में वो convert हो गया था. Now he was actually competing with other dogs. उन्हीं की तरह तेज भागता था, उन्हीं की तरह he was hunting rats, so he was doing everything that the other dogs were doing. So I carried him back along the passage to front of the house. The chauffeur was still holding the car door open, and when Tricky saw his mistress, he took off from my arm in a tremendous leap and sailed into Mrs. Pumphrey's lap. So Tricky ने एक छलांग लगाई और Mrs. Pumphrey के lap में जा पहुंचा. So he was so happy to see his mistress. She gave a startled "oh" and then had to defend herself as he swarmed over her, licking her face and barking. So Tricky licked Mrs. Pumphrey, barked, and he was so happy. During the excitement, I helped the chauffeur to bring out the beds, toys, cushions, coats and bowls, none of which had been used. So इतने में जब वो एक दूसरे से मिल रहे थे, so Dr. Harriet ने वो सारी चीजें जो है वो वापस भिजवा दी, and those things they were not used even once. As the car moved away, Mrs. Pumphrey leaned out of the window, tears shone in her eyes. So Mrs. Pumphrey इतना खुश थी कि उनकी आंखों में आंसू आ गए. Her lips trembled. And actually, she had not been able to thank Mr. Harriet. So, as the car was moving out of the window, she said, "Oh, Mr. Harriet," she cried, "how can I ever thank you? This is a triumph of surgery." So, she announced that it was actually a miracle. It was a triumph of surgery to transform Tricky into such a muscled dog, a strong and muscled dog. So, this is the story. Now, the title. Let's see what is there in the title. Now, in the story, A Triumph of Surgery, Tricky actually gets another life at Dr. Harriet's surgery. So Tricky को actually दूसरी जो है जिंदगी मिलती है Dr. Harriet की surgery में. So if Tricky had not been taken to surgery, the story would have been different. Tricky becomes extremely fat because he is overfed by his mistress, Mrs. Pumphrey. The dog thus is not able to move much and becomes inactive. When things become out of control and Tricky starts vomiting, Mrs. Pumphrey becomes worried. It is then the tact of Dr. Harriet, who knows what the real problem is, saves Tricky. He knows if he has to save Tricky, he needs to take away Tricky from Mrs. Pumphrey. So Tricky is kept under a strict regime with lots of physical exercise at Dr. Harriet's surgery. Within a fortnight, Tricky is transformed into a hard, muscled, energetic dog. So all this actually has happened at the surgery. Tricky's progress is an achievement for everyone at the surgery, especially for Dr. Harriet. So victoriously, Dr. Harriet returned Tricky to Mrs. Pumphrey, who too is amazed to see Tricky strong and active. So Dr. Harriet की वो achievement जो है वो तारीफ के काबिल थी और डॉक्टर हैरियट ने ट्रिकी को बिल्कुल सही सलामत एकदम स्ट्रॉन्ग ट्रिकी को मिसेस पम्फ्री को वापस किया. So for her the transformation is a miracle and therefore she calls it a triumph of surgery, giving all the credit to Dr. Harriet for the change. Thus, since the best part of the story happens at the surgery, the title is apt and justified. So this is the story, a humorous story but a very reflective message. So these are the image credits and that's all for today. I'll be coming up with a self-evaluation test, important question answers and one or two extracts from the chapter, but for that you do need to subscribe to my channel, give this video a thumbs up and also go and have a look at the playlist for other videos. Follow me on Instagram for the latest updates. Bye for now and happy watching.